All right, so when was it last week? Several sessions ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah, several sessions ago. So what we did was we reviewed that there are two ways of experiencing the world. One is experiencing the world as a place of things, and the other is looking at the world, experiencing the world as a forum for action. Yeah, that first one, a place of things, that's really science, and it's kind of interesting to think about how, well, we've only been really doing that one for 500 years. It's not normal to experience, I don't know if it's not normal, not in a pejorative way, but it's not in our bones to experience the world as a place of things. It's a place of meaning. And by definition, meaning demands action. What's kind of cool, something really, really important to know actually, is how you set up your goals, how you set up and decide what you want to do, actually determines how you look at the world. So the goals we create for ourselves actually determine how we instantaneously see the world. So I'll give you an example. If put a chair in front of the door here, and if my goal is to leave this room, that chair automatically, without me even thinking, well, that's an obstacle. It's something I don't want. Whereas if my goal is to sit down in a chair, it becomes something I want. And it's so interesting because it's not something I even consider. I don't get to look at every single object in the world and decide what I want it to be. It's once I have my goals and once I have the way I want to perceive the world set up, well, then that's what the world looks like. So we see meaning first, and we see that meaning because of how we decide what we want the world to mean to us. The more you look at it, the easier it gets. One of the weird parts about human suffering is there's really just two ways of doing it. There's the way that you don't want, where you don't want it, like you're running away from it. And we didn't talk about so much about this, but like the human brain is divided into hemispheres, and one half of it, one way of thinking about it is being a prey animal, and the other half is being a predator. The left hemisphere is you're a predator. And the right hemisphere is you're a prey animal, little bunny rabbit, better run. And when you run from problems, when you run from pain, well, that right hemisphere is just sparking. The little bunny rabbit running away. So that's very painful. It's incredibly painful. It's when you willingly chase after what's painful, you get to be a predator. The left hemisphere starts spiking up. And it's the same pain, same stimuli, but actually feels less painful when you go after it, when you hold it. I mean, this is it's kind of cool, all the differences in different types of therapy and all these different theories, but the one fundamental commonality between them all is this idea that when you face what's dangerous, when you face what's painful, then you conquer it. It doesn't hurt. Eventually it goes away. And when you make that decision, are you going to be a prey animal or predator? Well, then the world actually opens up to you in a different way. You see things you would not have seen before. Doors open up to you that you simply just would not have existed, because it's at this moment of engaging the world you actually get to construct a fair amount of it. Is the world going to get you, or are you going to get the world? So we see meaning first. And it's that meaning that demands action. I think the example I gave last time was, being a little kid, seeing the scary stranger. I mean, that's the meaning in the experience, and that demands the action of, well, maybe you want to run and hide, maybe it is too much to bear, and that motivates action. There's meaning everywhere. And so we're constantly kind of thinking about, well, what is what we want things to be, and by being able to see those two things, that demands answering the question, how are you going to get there? That demands the action on your part. This is the idea of being on the derech. It's a process of living. And that's what really halacha is. Halacha is a process. It's not, I said last time, it's not so much this rule checklist where you just check off all the different rules. That's very basic. What ultimately halacha is trying to develop in a person is the ability to live out the experience. It's a mastery of the thing, as opposed to just knowing what the rules of the game are. It's the difference between this idea of, well, there's a halacha, you keep Shabbos, as opposed to, well, how do you do that? How do you live your life in such a way that, well, bore just isn't a problem? For a lot of kind of an idea that expresses this, a lot of converts they can't keep Shabbos. It's forbidden for a convert to keep Shabbos when they're in the process. And so it is nerve-wracking trying to figure out how to actually, on a Mederaisa level, on a Torah level, how do you actually break Shabbos? It's near impossible. And it's not because there's anything, it's not because it's impossible to break Shabbos, but rather it's really because the way that Jewish life has been organized, the way that we structure a Jewish home, the way that a Jewish society moves through the day of Shabbos, it almost becomes impossible to actually break Shabbos. And that's the goal of what to take out of halacha. I mean, both are true. You want to keep the rules, but the main point is the process of living that life, living Shabbos as opposed to it being a check on the list. Yeah, I kept Shabbos today. So in order to do that, you need to know yourself, and you need to know what sort of life you're living. And what I offered you guys was the idea that life is like a game, or it's like a story, more or less the same sort of metaphor. Because stories are really all about what actions mean. That's every story is describing that. And secondarily, in describing what actions mean, well, every story that you've ever read is also describing how to solve a problem. It's what makes a story meaningful. So I presented you guys that there's roughly 3 different types of stories we live in life. There's the creation story, where there is chaos and there's the emergence from chaos. This is, as the archetype to this, well, this is Bereshis. God created the world, Tov Vohu, and from chaos, God created order. And there's the catastrophe story. It's the exact opposite. Everything's fine, and all of a sudden the monster from the deep grabs you. It's Jaws, for example. It's every story similar to that. And that's another story that people live. And the last story is a combination of those two. It's the hero's journey. It's the way narrative, where normal life's going on and something happens, and you are confronted by chaos. And the challenge in this hero's journey is to face the chaos, to take everything that you've learned in your normal life, face the problems head on, go into the dragon's cave, and you recreate yourself based on what you know, with everything that you've experienced, gets translated into this new experience. You expand yourself in that way. That's kind of like the story of the 40 years of wandering. The Jewish people, they were supposed to trust Moshe Rabbeinu. You guys got the Torah. Just go into Eretz Yisrael and take it over. But they couldn't do it. They faced chaos and they flinched. They didn't want to enter the dragon's cave. So because of that, they had to wander through 40 years of working out. Well, how could they now rebuild themselves and pull themselves out of that chaos? And they did. It took a generation to do, but they did, and they were able to enter Eretz Yisrael, and we claimed our nationhood. Big things happen when you face what you fear. So those are the 3 narratives I presented you guys. And I ended with the point that looking at life in this way, when we come up with 2 different categories of rules. We have meta rules. I think it's fair to say there are 3. Just based on looking at how God created the world. I also think this is Pirkei Avos, the world being supported by Torah, Avoda, and Gemilas Chasadim, as representing Torah being getting straight. Well, what are your values? Where are you looking to go? And getting straight, what goals do you have to achieve to reach those values? How do you want to see the world? Are you the predator or are you the prey? Avoda's sacrifice, that in order to do that, we can't just accept what is. We want to get to what could be, what ought to be, and that demands sacrifice. It demands that we give up, in many respects, who we are so we can become bigger, that we don't trip over our own shoelaces. And the last, Gemilas Chasadim, is, what's the biggest chesed you could do to anyone or for anybody or for yourself, most importantly, is just don't lie. And that's the biggest sacrifice you can make, is don't lie in the sense of you have to sacrifice falsehood, even though it's comfortable. It feels good in the now. And I don't mean in a hedonistic, pleasure-seeking way. It's just not scary. That's something to, it's fair enough. You gotta, that's something that we all have to tackle, and it's not demeaning to be afraid of something. It doesn't make you less than, but it's something you have to be willing to confront and sacrifice. That, one of the biggest tragedies a person tells themselves is, this is it. That's the biggest lie people tell themselves. It ain't getting better, or you already have the answer. It's basically the same thing. Either everything is meaningless and there is no answer, or I already have the answer. But that's actually the same standing point. So those are the meta rules, and the second category of rules is, the actual nitty-gritty, the details of the game. If you think about a baseball game, how you play baseball, the meta rules are, you have to hit a ball and run around a couple bases and get to home plate. But there's all these specifics, how you hold the bat, your knuckles have to line up just right when you're holding the bat, and how do you run properly so you don't cause an injury? Don't land on your heels while you're running. You want to land on the ball of your foot instead. You just don't want to get an injury. You want to play the full season. There's all these details that exist that, they sit within the meta rules. That's the details of halacha. That's the details of halacha. So now, once we have clear, those are the games we're playing. That's the story, the 3 stories we live out, and more or less have a sense of what the rules are. So the last component you have to get straight is figuring out, what character are you in the story? Or characters in the story of your life? And so that leads us to the second principle of the Rambam, is the unity of Hashem. So the Rambam, the way he writes out this principle, this fundamental belief in Judaism, he writes, this is English translation. He says that the second foundation of God, a belief in God, is God's unity. May He be exalted. That this one, who is the cause of existence of everything, is one. His oneness is unlike the oneness of a genus or of a species, nor is it like the oneness of a single composite individual, which can be divided into many parts. Nor is his oneness like that of a simple body, which is one in number, but infinitely divisible. But he, may he be exalted, is one with a oneness for which there is no comparison at all. This second foundation is attested to by the verse, "Hear Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one." Shema. This is the second principle in Jewish belief. So the Rambam kind of expands this principle in his Mishnah Torah, where he writes that anything outside of this concept of oneness is limited. So it's really kind of a funny concept. It's not something that exactly exists in our reality. It's almost like saying that Hashem is one or is unified or any of these other sort of ways of putting it is a bit artificial because it doesn't actually exist in this world. We lack a better term in describing God. And so I kind of approaching this principle, I think it's actually easier to understand it when you live it out first. right now, as we're talking about it, we're just kind of taking this idea as face value, but this is something that there's a moral imperative here that we can get a taste for. In the Rambam Sefer Mitzvahs, he kind of hints at what this moral imperative is. Because he says that, it's for this concept of unity of God that we were taken out of Mitzrayim, and that we were given this, this idea of Ol Malchus Shemayim, this the divinity of existence. Maybe a fair way of defining that term. So there's a moral injunction here. It's almost like, we have this mitzvah saseh of emulating God. Well, this is a big one to emulate. How exactly the way I'm kind of describing it to you is, how do you do the impossible? How do you do something which is not within reality? The answer is in this Rambam. We have to try and strive to first be aware of the different parts of who we are. So we're not just one character in our story. There's many different aspects of us. And it's a matter of being able to understand this concept, being able to live this concept. It's really striving for first understanding those parts and not being a hypocrite in face of them. It's shlemus, it's integration. And I think I shared with you, I love this quote from Carl Jung. He says, I'd rather be whole than good. That's his line. Because when you're whole, that actually is what enables you to be good. It's the things about us that we're unaware of, or the things that we deny, that are usually the things that cause us trouble. And so it's a bit counterintuitive. It's like, well, how do you be a good person? Well, first you got to learn how you're not a good person. Or, not even in a moral sense, but like, what are your failings? Putting them on a table and saying, well, this is what is. And I mean, that can be painful because we don't want to face it. But at the same time, it sets up a map for what you do need to work on. And the more honest you are in making that map, the easier it's going to be to integrate those aspects of yourself, to become one, like Hashem. Religion demands, it's really kind of a cool thought, all the different halachas and obligations and all the oughts. They demand that we raise our gaze higher. Because the opposite of this is nihilism. Instead of things having a lot of meaning, well, the other option is they don't have meaning at all. And there's a trade-off in that. In the sense that, well, if one is nihilistic and there is no meaning, well, nothing's judging you, essentially. There is no burden to carry. There is no goals to achieve. There is no greater purpose. In many respects, that can be a relief, not having to face those judgments. But the trade-off is you don't actually get to have meaning in your life. That is the trade-off. It even gets worse because your body is hypersensitive to pain. And that pain, that getting back to that metaphor of seeing the stranger, that's meaning. So it's like, if you set up your life to not have positive meaning, all you're going to be left with, by definition, by default, is painful meaning. Why the heck would you want that? Well, in order to escape that, you have to raise your gaze higher. You have to have the outlined, this sort of religious life where you're pushing for transcendence, where you're pushing to carry a heavier burden, where you're pushing to fulfill more of your potential, to unlock more of you. It's kind of cool, putting it this way, this idea of transcendence, what does that equate into biologically? When you expose yourself to new experiences, there's actually large chunks of your genetic code that are not activated. They're just not turned on. And so when you go into new experiences, when you expose yourself to novelty, things that might even upset you, well, you actually get the chance to unlock all this potential in your genetic code. things just start turning on that have been there the entire time. But the only way to access that is to first accept and to build meaning in your life that pushes you to explore, pushes you to go further. Right now, it's kind of interesting that, in the West especially, there's this current trend, this movement of spirituality. And what they're all trying to shoot for is having this transcendent experience, this sort of spiritual awakening, but without the organized religious aspect to it. And so that's kind of trying to have the best of both worlds. Have the transcendence without the obligations. Have the deep spiritual experience without obligation for action. I have no idea how that one's going to work. I don't know how could it. Because it's the structure of religion, the structure of those meta laws and the specifics of halacha that hold the potential to allow a person to transcend. It's the demand for action that raises your gaze upward to maintain the transcendent experience. I mean, you'll have it. We talked about this before, get some psilocybin and have a nice time. You will have a one-off spiritual experience, but it will be a one-off spiritual experience. There might even be a little wisdom in that cheat, but it's wisdom unearned. And that's why it can't last. I wonder if this is the meaning behind the story of the Tower of Babel. That they want that here we have a group of humanity. They're getting together to build this massive tower. They're trying to elevate themselves. They're trying to transcend their own experience, but they're also trying to kill God. They want to have the transcendent experience without the structure, without the obligation. And taking this idea of setting your sights higher and one step further, the word to transgress, to be over in the halacha, is an archery term. Interesting. It's not so much that we look at failing as being within Judaism as lacking something, because you don't lack anything. I mean, you're built in the image of God, for goodness sakes. Like, you're not lacking. That's not it. It's you miss a target. It's a better way of looking at it. You're not deficient. Sometimes you need to look where you're shooting and hit the target. And if you don't, well, you miss the target. And that's really maybe a better way of looking at this. So backing up the train here. So, how if the Rambam's right here and that the whole experience of Mitzrayim is all about, and this, accepting this burden of responsibility, the Omachus Shemayim, if that's really all for the sake of understanding oneness, well, let's read the story. Let's break it down. The Ramban, if you guys ever go through his commentary on the Chumash, he's really interesting because he pushes this point farther, I think, than anybody. I take a lot from his thinking, in the sense of he looks at every book in the Chumash, Bereshis, Shemos, and onwards, as being a story of everyone's life. That it starts out with these, the individual avos. They represent, the things that they experience. It's almost like it's a blueprint for all the things we're going to experience, and that's mirrored as the nation. That the story of Shemos is the same story as the avos in Bereshis, and that these stories are going to actually be the same stories we play out in our own lives. So they're worth reading because that's exactly what we're living. That's how he looks at it. So as I was breaking down the Yetzias Mitzrayim story, it seemed like there were 7 parts. It made me giggle because 7 days of creation. So I'm not claiming it is true. I just thought it was kind of funny, because it is a creation story. Because the story starts out of Yetzias Mitzrayim really from the perspective from the Avos, these great heroes who had been self-sacrificing and strived for wisdom and made that their goal of life. That was their target, to become more wise, to better understand how to act more properly in the world. And the more times they hit that target, what eventually happened is they had such clarity of what the meaning of life was, they started actually talking to God. Then tragedy strikes. There's a famine. There's going to be things in life that just happen. They're outside of one's control. That the support systems in life are just going to be kicked out from underneath you. And what's interesting about that part of the story is we see there's different midrashim about it, that Yaakov and the 12 brothers, well, they all actually were preparing. They'd saved up just in such a case. Maybe there will be a famine. It's not as though, that's a part of wisdom is the more clarity you have and the more you refine yourself, the more you realize that sometimes the things that seem like natural disasters, like famine, are actually caused by human negligence. If you would have saved up the food, you wouldn't be starving. Have I talked to you guys about Hurricane Katrina before? Same idea. The Hurricane Katrina story. You just have to make a better dike. That's really what it is. They didn't do it. Didn't have the foresight. Because, the level 5 hurricanes only happen once every 100 years. That's not a natural disaster. That's human negligence. So these things do happen in life. And sometimes our best efforts might not be good enough. They don't necessarily destroy us, but you can't save yourself from pain. And why would you want to? Pain, when you're living well, pain serves as a fantastic teacher. When you make all the right moves, it eventually becomes that. Something that, the book I kind of suggested to you guys to check out. Pain actually reflects the values that you have. They go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. And it is merely like the whispering of God in your ear. The values you hold as dear, maybe you have to try and work harder to walk in that direction. It's a missing of what you want. So that's what you want to have that voice. You don't want it screaming in your ear 24/7. That's a different problem. So what ends up happening is, Yosef was able to manage to work himself out in Mitzrayim, and he's the king of sorts, and it's the son that has to end up taking care of the father. And this is something we're all going to eventually, unfortunately, have to experience. I make a joke of this with my daughters. I'm going to get old one day, and honey, you're going to be taking care of me.
How old are they?
She's 11.
You're going to give her anxiety.
Nah. It's exposure therapy. You start them out young. Defragilize them. Oh, it's a joke, but there's truth to that. The younger generation at a certain point has to, so to speak, become the caretaker, become the parent. That's a hard one. But he willingly allows himself to do that. Things are tough in Israel at this time, but also this is the next stage of life. We have to allow our children to take care of us. We're not just physically unable, but a lot of times, even I don't want to say intellectually unable, but the world changes. The world that I was born into, a world of cassette tapes, is definitely not the world that exists now. There's a certain press in society where, society is kind of stagnant a little bit. And the new generation has to come along and take what's worth saving from the old generation and retranslate it into what's now. And that's what it means for a child to take care of their parent. They're worth taking care of, is the idea. Even if they don't necessarily seemingly have any function. No, they do. They're still worth taking care of. So they go down to Mitzrayim and they start a new life there. And while there, they make the right choices. Okay, in a bad situation, you still have to go through the checklist of how do I make this okay? They picked a land that was far enough away from the rest of the Egyptian culture, where they would still be able to live out the values they had developed, the wisdom they had achieved from the Avos. And this is the next sort of almost like turning point, danger point. And something that, it's a common enough experience in yeshivas and seminaries when everyone goes back home. If you guys do decide to go back home, that's definitely going to be a challenge you guys are going to face. You guys have learned a particular way of life, and you've learned a lot of wisdom here, and you've learned how to do it here. What you learn is not some sort of like floating in the sky idea you just grab onto, but is dependent upon the place you stand. So you have to almost literally relearn everything you learned here in the new land you go to. You literally have to relearn it. I guess if you guys have had this experience, it's a small taste of it. Most of you guys like rode on a bus before you came to Israel, right? So you remember that first time you came to Israel and like you're trying to figure out, well, how do you ride the buses here? It's not like it was impossible, and you guys, you know how to ride the bus. So like, well, why was that? Why did you feel a little anxious? Why was there some hesitation getting on? I bet you were way more aware of what's going on your first Israeli bus than you were back home. Well, you know how to ride a bus, but you don't know how to ride a bus here. It's the same idea, just miniature. So that's the problem that they were facing in Mitzrayim. How do we retranslate all the wisdom that we gained from our forefathers to the extent that they learned how to talk to God? Well, how do you learn how to talk to God in Mitzrayim? The Midrashim say that the Shechina came with Yaakov down to Mitzrayim. And I think that's the idea it's striking on, is that, well, you can always access God wherever you are. He's always there, but you always have to learn how to restart that conversation. How do you talk to God when you're in Mitzrayim? So what ends up happening is, this is where they stumble. Instead of being more careful, relearning how to translate their values into Mitzrayim, they start adopting the values of the culture they live in. This actually, I think, is the Lot story. I haven't seen anyone else who puts it this way, but I think it's mamish right. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hersh describes the Lot story, comparing it to Avraham. Well, he says Lot isn't a bad guy. Everyone almost puts him as he's the bad guy, Nick, and that's why he went to Stone, and he went to where he belongs. It's Rav Hersh says no, that's not the case. There was a debate. How do you bring wisdom, God's wisdom, into the world? And Lot said, you know what? I learned a lot here with Avraham, and I think the best way to do is you jump right into the worst possible place. You go to Stone, you go to Vegas, and you open up a community kollel in Vegas. That's how you do it. He had wonderful intentions. He had what to give. But the end of that story is the values of Stone rubbed off on him more than the other way around. It incapacitated him to the point where when the mob was at his door, he offers his own daughters in order to do chesed, the value he learned from Avraham, the wisdom that he gained from his experience with Avraham to do chesed, perverted it. So it's not like this simple black and white, good and bad sort of thing. It's like, well, you think you're doing good, but these other values, these other perspectives do seep in. Perverted a bit. Or what Avraham did was exactly what it seemed like Yaakov was trying to do when entering Mitzrayim. Is you see Avraham in all of his travels, he's always halfway between the desert and civilization. Sometimes he pops in a little bit into a city, he hangs out there for a little while, then he goes right back into the desert. There's this balance of being true to yourself. You have to be an individual. You have to stand up for what's right. But the longer that you don't want to hide from society, you have to go back into the fray. You have to give, but not at the expense of who you are. So sometimes you have to take a break. Sometimes if you're going to open up that community kollel in Las Vegas, well, maybe you have to schedule every year coming back to Eretz Israel to study at the kollel that you'd been in for the past 10 years. You have to put the gas back in the tank, something like that. So they didn't do that. And instead, the Midrashim kind of describe that that the Mitzrayim were asking for their involvement in construction projects. Develop Egyptian society, and that's a noble cause, kind of like Lot. Let's give back to society. But what ended up happening is as they started to sacrifice their values, at the same time they were losing personal agency. Well, what's somebody who doesn't have personal agency? Well, that's a slave. That's how you become a slave. You might not have a living, breathing master, but without those values, without that burden, without raising your gaze up and always trying to transcend what you are, now you're a slave. That's life without value is only pain. That's all you get as a slave. But what happens is that there is something called schus avos. When you hit on something worthwhile to do with your life, when you do take on, even if you'll give them up later, you're taking on a lot of obligations now. You're learning. We talked about, like maybe if it's a little chaotic, all the things you're learning in seminary, but you're still taking on worthwhile values. Those don't ever go away. Transcendence is hard, but once you've cashed in, it's there to stay. And the schus avos makes its reappearance in the form of Moshe and Aaron. And they serve as a guiding light to the rest of the nation, reminding them what is it to be a free person. And so they're let out of Mitzrayim. And they're able to reclaim willingly those values that they had initially lost. And then some. That's the giving of the Torah. They get their personal agency back. They're no longer slaves. But they did that willingly. And it was only through, again, confronting the darker aspects, the mistakes, the realization that they had made a wrong turn in their national life, integrating the parts of themselves they rather would not have wanted to face, that enabled them to stop being slaves. And that's hard to do. And I think that's also why, the Midrashim talk about, it wasn't exactly, not everybody survived, not all the Jewish people there survived the Yetzias Mitzrayim experience. Some of them, I guess, were knocked off during the plague of darkness. That they didn't choose to face all the parts of who they were, to regain personal agency. So I think I've tried to kind of reconstruct that story to really push this idea that the Rambam's getting at in this principle of unity is it's that full integration of who we are. So what's the other side? What are we facing? Really the question of what's evil. The lack of meaning. So in Sefer Yeshayahu, there's a pasuk, and we actually say a variation of this in our davening. Yoser or uvorei choshech, osei shalom uvorei ra, ani Adonai osei kol ele. I am God, I created all of these. The Malbim has a really cool description of this pasuk. Got a lot of things flying here, because he's describing, there's this link between darkness and evil that's being made here, and he says that really evil is just emptiness. The word that's used in this pasuk to describe evil, there's different types of creations. There's different types of ways God created. One is to be bore something, and one is to be yotzer something. So to be bore something, bara in this case, means it's merely going from nothingness to somethingness without form. So evil is nothing, essentially. It's chaos. There's no order to it. It has no form. It's empty. The Malbim almost like, in his commentary, it almost sounds like he's making a little joke about it. He's like, what is it? Well, you can't really ask the question. Empty's empty. That's what that is. So good, Yotzer Or, is this other type of creation. Once you barad something, being Yotzer is a second stage of creation where you fashion, you give it form, you give it order. You're going from chaos to order. That's what Yotzer is. So good is it's the lived substance of all of reality. Another way of kind of thinking about this, the Ramban says something very similar in that, when God created all of the world, Bereshis bara Elokim, he first created tohu vavohu, and took from that, taking from that kernel, drew out everything from tohu vavohu. He drew everything out of chaos and gave it form. Well, everything in our world has form. Everything has non-chaotic substance. Meaning the vast majority of reality is good. That's what I'm selling you right now. And it's only when in our personal lives, when we don't exercise our personal agency, what we're really doing is we're simply not filling the void. We're allowing the void to be. And I have a lot of hope in this idea because, God was not Yotzer evil. It has no form. It's not as compelling, it's not as potent as good is in the world. So you might all be thinking, okay, yeah, right, Rabbi, you think that the world is getting better. Well, I listen to the news, it doesn't sound that way. So I sat down. There's a couple really good researchers that push back on this idea. One, his name is Steven Pinker. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. But what he did, he said, I really believe that the world's getting better. And so he sat down and he dedicated all of his research of tracking human progress throughout history. And basically it's only been getting good, like dramatically good. There's never been a point in human history things have not been getting better. On every matrix of human suffering, life is constantly getting better and better and better. Whether it be less diseases, less war, literally living longer, living with less pain. And it's not just getting better, but it's getting better more quickly. It grows exponentially. The good that we're going to see in our lifetime is something that our grandparents could never have dreamed of. And you think about, it wasn't even so long ago, 1850 in the United States, people were living on $1 a day, according to modern monetary standards. Everyone was in abstract poverty. And nowadays, the UN estimates that in just a couple of years, they're going to eliminate all of poverty in the entire world. It will not exist. And I think it was a couple of years ago, one of the biggest problems of life was famine. You're kind of getting back to Yetzias Mitzrayim story. I think nowadays there's more obese people living than people who are starving. It just happened a couple of years ago. And the only reason why there's starvation in this world is because you have a couple governments like North Korea who by design are denying people food. It's, again, that idea of it's human error that's causing suffering. It's not nature. The world is getting better. And so it's, you're part of that. That is the world you live in. And I think it's, a large part of why the world is getting better is because there is this belief that's spelled out in Torah, that the more you take on, the more you face problems, those problems will be answered. And that nature is made in such a way that the cards are stacked in your favor. You just have to do it. You've already been told, you've already been guaranteed a victory. And these are big humanity victories I'm spelling out for you. But that's the life you independently as an individual also get to live. It will also get better for you. As long as you play the game. Keep to the rules. Know the story that you're in. figure out who you are. This idea of integration. Maybe next week we'll get a little more into the specifics of how to do that.